Okay, so first and foremost, the rest of the week, your finals due by Friday. You guys both said you had final times. Okay. If you have any issue with the library, because I know they've gotten pretty full, let me know and we'll work to fix it. The paper's due. Let me do the 3rd, didn't I? Or was it due? Yes. Okay. Okay. So your paper's due tomorrow night by 11:59 p.m. There is an oral presentation with that. This is our last semester under the JD rules, and we're required to do an oral presentation. That's more from your four-year schools than anything else. So that's also due tomorrow. Any questions about all that stuff?
The oral presentation, that's not due till the 4th, right? The day after?
I believe so. I've got three different classes with oral presentations due this week, and they all have a different due date. So whatever's on the assignment sheet. Okay. Next, you guys asked, so I'll reiterate for Haley what you bring to the library. Bring a textbook, scratch paper. You know, for like the essay section, you can write an outline or whatever you need to do. You're not going to be allowed to have your phone in there.
Where do we put our phones, or do we just not take our phones?
They'll put them in the front desk if you want. They can keep them there. And then the Respondus browser will be on. It's the same thing as we've had for all of our tests. This again is under JD rules. You know, where it's just making sure that in online hybrid classes that if you're testing online, it's to make sure that the person who's taking the class is taking the test. Any questions about the library? Or?
I have one more question. You
Sure.
said the scratch paper. Do we need to like rip that out of our notebooks, or can we take a notebook with us?
I don't have a problem taking a notebook, but if the library had an issue, just go ahead and rip it out before you get started. Now, the only thing that's different about the final is it's not 4 sections, it's 3. The short answer and passage ID are all in 1 section. So that's probably your biggest grind on the final to get through that. That's going to be your longest section probably. Okay, so let's look at the study guides. And in terms of the studying for test 2 and 3, the study guides, I'm kind of going to go over those fairly briefly. You've already taken the test on them. You've all done well on the test. So the issues, the ideas, the themes that are expressed in those works, you guys have demonstrated that you're pretty comfortable with. But I do want to, better late than never, school for thought with these study guides. I want to start with going over the overall instructions because this is really important for any test. Make sure that you read the work introductions and the period introductions. There will be questions on this test from these sections. I think somebody like Douglas, even Moliere, Swift to a lesser extent, knowing a little bit of the background of the person or the ideas expressed. Like with the orature, the introduction is pretty important to kind of understanding the connectivity of those stories. So make sure that you're familiar with those. Work titles and authors. Now, as far as like the passage identification and stuff like that, I could see it kind of being daunting in 272 because unlike 271, you have a lot more authors attributed to the works. But what I would say is on the passage ID, the works are pretty major. So, I mean, you guys can probably know off the top of your head the Gulliver's Travels, Swift, Moliere wrote Tartuffe, Douglas wrote his own work, stuff like that. I'm not going to make you, you know, shall I compare thee to a summer's day and pull that out of your well, that's Shakespeare, but.
I was going to ask if the poems like the small ones, like Death Constantly on Love, that one should be one, right? Because that's a longer one, but the like smaller ones.
I would say, well, we took a pretty close look at proof rock in class. I would know that one, or be able to recognize it, I should say. But other than that, with the poems, you should be able to look at a poem and this is on the final study sheet. You should be able to look at a poem and by the theme and the subject have a pretty good idea of what era it came from. Because if it's going to be on the test, it'll be pretty representative of the Enlightenment, the Romantics, the Victorians, the Modernists, yeah, that sort of thing. Did I answer your question, I hope?
Yeah.
Okay. Just a reminder, I don't think it's been an issue for you guys, but it's not necessary to provide the author and title information for the short answer. I've had students in the past spend time that could be taken answering the question, do that. The work overviews that I have posted on Canvas, it's a good idea to be familiar with those. Actually, for the works you've already read, it's simply not practical this time of year for you guys to reread all those things. But you can read a 1 or 2 page overview for the major works in studying. And those are in the modules tab. And if those don't work, go to the Lit Resource Center through the library's webpage. And that will probably lead you to an overview that would be, successful. And then all you're doing is kind of refreshing your memory when you're studying for a final. You should review the discussion questions that we've had on the off days, the hybrid days. Usually, you're going to have a short answer question about those, or the ideas that you explored in those discussion questions are ideas you might need to express on the final. And do remember that sections 1 and 2 consider a closed book, and that's, as far as the time limit goes. I do consider the essay portion to be open book.
The essay for the final, I cannot remember for 271. Is it going to be like the past test and have 3 topics to choose from, or is it just one?
Okay, the essay portion of tests 1 through 3, I'm asking you to use a work for that test. So if it's test 3, use a work since test 2. For the final, all the works that we've had in the class are open. So this is especially advantageous to you guys at this point in the term, because if you've written your research paper on something that was earlier in the term and you're really familiar with it, you can use that for your essay portion of the final. So yeah, it can be cumulative in terms of your essay. Good question. Other questions? Okay, well, let's dive into the study guide. Like I said, I'm not going to go, these are primarily the questions we went over in class, or the major idea questions if it was a hybrid day. In terms of Bartleby the Scrivener, the primary issues that we're looking at is that isolation, depression, and psychology that Melville really likes to explore. And the mystery, why are some people the way they are? But also how that depression or feeling of being isolated affects the narrator as well. Because really, if we're looking at a protagonist in that story, it's really the narrator, because he's the one that has a character change through the experience. Bartleby's more or less the same throughout, other than deciding to stop eating and perishing. He's not that much different a character at the end, which of course make Bartleby the antagonist in this case. Frederick Douglass. Now, some things with the slave narrative. One of the critical things for the slave narratives was to assure the audience that they wrote it and this is their actual story. Because, as much as we like to think of ourselves as unique, the political climate in the 1850s is not that much different in terms of people have their way of thinking, and if they're presented with information that goes against their way of thinking, they look for holes in it. You know, so today it's things like, I don't know, climate change or media or whatever it might be. The big issue of the day in the 1850s, of course, was slavery. So people who are pro-slavery were looking for ways to discount this account, whereas abolitionists wanted to kind of heighten his story. But it's important that Douglas illustrate that he wrote it, because they're trying to prove that it's not just abolitionist propaganda, this is how slaves are treated. Because in the North, you had plenty of people that didn't necessarily like slavery, but they lived in Indiana. Slavery isn't legal. You know, it's just that kind of Southern thing. You know, they kind of pushed it away. And the intent of a work like Narrative of Life is to kind of wake people up to what's going on. So that's something unique to this slave narrative. But we can also look at this as a story, a creative nonfiction piece that should hold quite a bit of intrigue for us as readers. We start with his childhood. In terms of knowing Douglas, the scenes with Covey, especially the fight, and him learning to read in Baltimore are critical moments to him becoming free, because they both allow him to become free in his mind, even if he's still in bondage physically. So those are kind of the themes or issues that you'd want to think about or focus on with Douglas. All right. And I forgot to put my Ibsen questions in there. It was very late when I was finishing this last night. But Ibsen, similar issues to what we had in 102 with the Dollhouse. It's a problem play where you have this woman who is trapped in a certain life because she's a woman. And there are two different respects. With Nora, it's more that she's so sheltered that she makes mistakes that aren't her fault because she's treated the way much of society would treat a young lady that had some means. Hedda's a bit of a different animal. With her, Ibsen is saying, you know, the only option that women have for the most part, especially somebody who comes from a prominent family like Hedda, is to get married and have kids. And she doesn't want that life. She wants a life of adventure and intrigue and vine leaves and hair and people who are exciting and dangerous. And she gets to an age where she doesn't have a choice. Whereas Nora gets married young. She's handed from her father to Torvald. Hedda puts off the standard, and then when she tries it, she's miserable. It just does not work for her personality. And it ends with her taking her own life. But again, too, Ibsen's trying to hold a mirror up to society and say, look, yes, this may be an extreme example of what can happen to a woman, but by not giving women options, by only giving them one track to live in life, it can cause problems. And with Nora, you know, it causes the disillusion of her marriage. The home is wrecked, but nobody dies. You know, Rank was going to die anyway. Whereas with Hedda, it's catastrophic. Loveberg dies, she dies, the baby inside her dies. Taya is heartbroken, although that's the only silver lining is we get the feeling that Tessman's going to end up with Taya eventually, and they're really suited for each other. You know, so and the judge plays into all of that. So think of problem play, think holding up mirror to society with Ibsen, and how he's doing that. With Chekhov, it's a lady with a pet dog. Starts in Yalta, they have an affair. He goes back to Moscow, can't stop thinking about her, and the affair continues on. Now, of course, and this is kind of typical of modern short stories, and this is what people like Edgar Allan Poe and Chekhov, and to the lesser extent, somebody like Henry James, began with the modern short story, is it's not necessarily all neat and tidy at the end. It's reflecting life a little more. Now, in terms of extramarital affairs and things like that, that's not a typical life for people. But can we believe this happening? The answer is yes, you know, that it's plausible. Whereas, well, think of folk tales or fairy tales, you know, is it likely that the prince is going to fall in love with the Little Mermaid just based on her looks? She can't talk. Of course, in the Grimm's fairy tales, she doesn't get the prince. She turns into sea foam and dies at the end without her prince. Those happy little Germans. But with Chekhov, he's really demonstrating a similar thing that we have with Hedda Gabler. Gurov is trying to live the life you're supposed to live. Get married, have kids, have a family, have a good job. That doesn't make him happy. But when he does find happiness, it's socially unacceptable. And Anna's in the same boat. You know, she got married. She's supposed to be nice to her husband, but her husband's a jerk. Can't get out of it. You know, what do you do in that situation? So now clearly society would say, well, you made your bed, you have to live with it. These are the choices you made, and this is the society you live in. But you might see a theme here that we've been talking about the whole class with really all three of the, you know, all the works that are on this first sheet, where you have an individual who doesn't fit into the society that they're born into. And trying to make changes in said society can have consequences. It does for Hedda. To a lesser extent with Gurov, it certainly, you know, has consequences for Bartleby. You know, he doesn't fit into society, and in an indirect way, it leads to his death. And then we get to Orature, which is kind of a different animal altogether, because we have a different individual, whether it's Aunt Nancy or Anansi or whoever it might be. We still have a character who's going against the grain. The Orature's at the bottom of the page. But really, the only thing you have to remember from the Orature is the commonalities that you see between the stories. The trickster character, whether it's Aunt Nancy or a spider, or what is the point of the trickster? So you guys tell me, because I've been yapping too much. What is the purpose of a folk tale? Or if it's easier, a fairy tale? Why do we have these stories?
Something different, right?
Well, yeah, for this class, certainly. But why do they exist in society? You know, what does Johnny Appleseed tell us? What does Rip Van Winkle tell us? I'm going with American folk stories here. What does the story of Cinderella tell us? What's the purpose of these stories?
Are all of them happy?
Depends on what country you're getting it from. If you've ever lived through a German winter, you'd know why they're not so happy. Well, let's pick one that we know well, since this was a movie recently. What is technically the moral of the story of Beauty and the Beast?
Don't judge someone by how they look.
And the beast is punished by that, and Belle is celebrated because she can look past outer beauty. Now, my opinion is a little bit different on Beauty and the Beast. It's usually my female students hate me for. Because I think that the Beast hasn't changed. I think he's just as shallow as he always was. Falls in love with the smartest, most beautiful girl in the land. Gee, that was hard. But the moral of the story, of course, is it's about inner beauty, because the person with the most outward beauty, other than Belle, Gaston, he's the biggest, he's the strongest, he exhibits all the manly characteristics, has money, he has good looks, but he's the most horrible person on the inside. And the ugliest person, the Beast, at least what they want you to believe, is he's the person who has the good heart inside. Now let's relate this back to the orature. What are we supposed to get? What's the overall purpose of folk tales or fairy tales?
To learn a lesson?
Yeah, to learn a lesson, to take something out of it. If we're talking about, say, Cinderella, it's that if you're patient and you work hard and continue to be a good person despite difficulties, good things will happen to you. Trying to think of other ones. I don't know, like The Princess and the Pea. If you're born to be something great, eventually that greatness will find you. And the orature works the same way. That we're learning from Anansi that a character who screws up the social norm does so to either teach those characters a lesson or to shake things up in such a way that the other characters learn to be more careful in the future, that they learn that their way of thinking isn't quite right. Things along those lines. And you can think of things like Aesop's Fables when you're thinking of the orature. Okay, I probably spent too much time on the orature. All right, test 3, or at least the works from test 3. The overall is the same. Now, with Conrad, the Heart of Darkness. A big part of this is the idea of colonialism, and we really get the idea of colonialism from the European perspective more so than the African perspective. Now, some of the themes that we should be looking for, thinking about Heart of Darkness, is this idea of doubling, where there's a yin and a yang. You could say that Marlowe doubles with Kurtz. Marlowe's intended, fair, white, frail European woman versus his African lover, mistress, whatever you want to call her, strong, dark, powerful, commands a room when she's in it. Darkness and light are bounced off each other. Also think about, I think this was a test question, what does Kurtz mean when he says the horror? And there's not one answer. There's been lots of articles by scholars who are more specialized in colonial literature than me that have made several different arguments. But just think about, how you would justify your answer to that question. Think about the frame narrative as well, because this entire story is being told on deck of a boat on the Thames River in London waiting for the tide. Why would Conrad do it this way? What advantage is it? I don't know if you've ever encountered the poem Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, but it's very similar, where the Ancient Mariner is telling the story on the deck of a boat waiting out fog. You guys have seen Titanic, or at least you're aware of the narrative structure, where you have Rose, old Rose, telling the story about the Titanic. Just like, say, we had a story like Araby in English 102. When you have an older narrator who's telling a story of the past, they know what they want you to get out of it. So it's not an accident that Marlowe lies to Kurtz's fiance about what his last words were. It's not the horror. His last thoughts were of her. So think about the relationship between the Europeans and the Africans. Think about the relationship between Marlowe and Kurtz, his kind of obsession with Kurtz, and also the way the natives are portrayed. A lot of times they're portrayed as savages, but then also you have like the cannibals, who in many ways are the most noble characters in the work. The ones that are on the boat helping them go up the river, the Congo, because they're loyal. A lot of the stuff or negative stuff kind of drips off of them. And I think that's not an accident on Conrad's part to have some Africans and aren't portrayed as just blanket savages. Now, don't get me wrong. There is an overriding racism in Heart of Darkness that would have been common to any European or American, any white person at the time. But at the time, this wouldn't necessarily have been considered a racist work. By modern day standards, of course it is. But we have to look at works when they're written, who wrote them, what were their standards and ideas about that. Now, number 11 here on the study guide, as you're reviewing, just think of what the major events, on the Thames, when he decides to go to Africa. Measuring his skull is something that a lot of critics focus on, because they thought it would shrink your brain to be in Africa. Just being exposed to Africa would make you less intelligent. The lower station, the middle station, where the boat's stuck. And it's not an accident that there's delay after delay after delay to fix the boat, because they're trying to kill Kurtz by not resupplying him. It's because he produces so much for the company, he can be a nut job, and the company back in Belgium doesn't care. Kurtz's station and the return and the end of the book. At the end of the book, the two things, Kurtz's last words and what Marlowe tells his fiancée the last words are probably the most important part of that. Okay, in terms of modernist poetry, I would review the poem Easter 1916. Why is this an important poem? It commemorates an event in Ireland during the First World War, where there was a rising in Dublin to become independent of Great Britain. It failed miserably. After a week, all the leaders of the rebellion were killed. Ireland did not achieve an independence until 1920. And then there was a civil war for a couple years. But just kind of review that poem and just know the main ideas of it. Now, the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. This is really a watershed poem for modernist poetry, because it explores things about modernism that are very common. Kind of the feeling of isolation or being lost. Because even though Prufrock is talking to somebody, there's definitely a sense of separation from the way he feels to the life he's living. The life he's living is just going from party to party. He's getting older. There's a lot of angst in modernist poetry. But not only that, there's also a lot of discussion and thought about the city and how that affects people's lives. Because you've got to remember, the city is a relatively new thing. The big city is only 50 or 60 years old. Okay, and then from the modern fiction, you know, Junot Diaz, Marquez, Achebe. That first question one, how is the picture of Africa different in this story than Heart of Darkness? That's for Achebe. Let's see. The two stories you should focus on for the final are Marquez and Diaz. The ideas expressed in Death Beyond Constant Love is really kind of that quintessential modernist work where it's somewhat experimental. You don't expect people to have chastity belts in the modern world. But how the senator feels so separate from the rest of the world around him. He's really an individual at odds with his society. And then he tries to use a position of power, and his ideas about life and the universe and all that sort of thing gets changed by this experience. Now he's dying, but there's almost a feeling like redemption for this man is possible before his death because of the events of that story. With Diaz, something to just remember with him is he's very in your face with his writing. And he's still writing today. I think he's teaching at Cornell. But one of our better living now American writers. He's from the Dominican Republic, but Pulitzer Prize winning author. But remember his in-your-face style and his honesty and upfront kind of, I like to call this kind of like urban literature, and not in the sense of like it's minority literature. It's very much literature of the city, kind of like Bartleby the Scrivener. You know, fast forward it 150 years, where you can't really separate Bartleby from it being in New York. I mean, it could take place in Chicago, Boston, but it's a city work. Okay, so that's test 3. Final exam. I went over this, I touched on this a little bit, but for the cumulative, in terms of the stuff you should know for the finals, I've already said, know the titles and authors of the major works. So, Gulliver, Tartuffe, Douglas, Ibsen, and the like. In terms of the poems and stuff, you probably just need to know Prufrock. Know the basic tenets of each era. That's Enlightenment, Romantic, Victorian, or 19th century, Modernist, Postmodern / present day. If you know the ideas that the writers were interested in with those eras, you will be able to identify or talk about a work where you recognize the ideas of an era, even if you can't remember the work itself. So you can look at a poem and say, okay, there's lots of angst here. It takes place in the city. There's a feeling of isolation or
So
lack.
That can be like kind of like the short answer for that poem.
Yeah. But you can look at a poem that exhibits those traits and say, okay, this is probably a modernist poem. If it's focusing on the individual, on nature, if there's kids in it, probably romantic. Enlightenment, if you're seeing a lot of stuff about reason and rational thought, the individual's place in society, that society takes precedence over the individual, all those sort of stuff, all of those sort of things would be Enlightenment values. So just kind of review the eras that we've gone through. Don't stress too much about this portion of the test. If you have been keeping up with the reading and taking all the tests, you should retain the vast majority of information you need to be successful on anything the final asks of you. And this is, you know, the long and the short of it. Just review what you've already read. Okay, so don't, you know, try to go reread them. You know, take a look at those work overviews for the major works and things like that, but don't super stress the cumulative. You guys have been in class, you've done all the work, you've done all the reading. It'll be fine.
Like, can we just go on like our previous test and just kind of look at those questions and answers? Will those be some of the same ones, or can you do those?
The multiple choices questions will be similar. Usually at the short answer, I ask you to talk about something since test 3 plus another work. Like for example, what other work we've had this term is Morrison's work. Apparently I didn't turn my phone off. Does Morrison's work remind you the most of, and why? Something like that. Let me turn my ringer off. Okay. Okay, the modern women. This is Lessing, Monroe, Kincaid, and Allende. After reading the story, remember the journal topic we had where I asked you the question, is there anything distinctly feminine about these works? And if so, what? Or is just good writing, good writing? Think about that question. Is there anything that women writers tend to be more interested than men? Or are they just writing about people? With Doris Lessing, with Old Chief Mishlanga, what alters the main character's perspective on life? How does she change after this? And how is the picture of Europeans and Africa different in this work compared to other works we've had this term? I'm specifically thinking of Conrad there. And Lessing, I think she has more of a desire, or at least her characters do, to understand the African's perspective, whereas her father is more like a lot of the Europeans you see in Conrad's work, whose idea is, well, we're here to civilize these people. They have a civilization already, doesn't that mean they're kind of civilized? With Monroe, really, and Monroe writes a lot of stories like this. How's a story about memory and what the narrator, who's now an adult, remembers? And in what ways is this a coming-of-age story? And the technical term for that is Bildungsroman, which is a German term, which means building novel. How is there lost innocence? Anytime we're talking about a coming-of-age story, it's taking a step, and some stories have smaller steps than others, toward adulthood. So if you're thinking like something like Red Badge of Courage, which is a story where a young man is fighting in the Civil War, probably Chancellorsville. He sees people die, gets injured, he fights in battles. That's a pretty large leap into adulthood. Whereas for something like, say, Araby, he has a crush that he realizes isn't going to come to fruition and he's acts silly because of it. That's a much smaller step toward adulthood. Jamaica Kincaid, girl. How does the narrator define herself, and why is this definition important to the story? It's a very short story, but there's a lot packed into it. And what insight do we get into Kincaid's culture? This, Caribbean woman of African descent. What do we learn about her culture through this story? With Allende, how does Clay connect the main characters? And we see this often in story where a thing, an idea, a theme, an object is used to connect the main characters. What did you make of the president's visit to the site of the disaster? What kind of commentary is Allende making here? And really, you can come up with any answer that you want. And let's see. All right, Nobel Prize winners. That was the reading for last Thursday. Primarily focus on you need to see the word to be able to pronounce it correctly. I'm sorry. Recitatif. Morrison's story. Now, that doesn't mean I don't want you to not read the other ones, but because this is such a complex story about race relations, because Morrison refuses to reveal which character's white, which character's black, because to her it doesn't matter. It matters to the characters, but she's trying to illustrate that people are people regardless of race or ideas or things like that. Let's see. Thinking about why there's a constant return to Maggie and who she is, and trying to examine memory and how it works is an interesting part of this story. Let's see. Why does Twyla stay at the demonstration carrying her sign even when the disorder of the group has made her own placard meaningless? I think that demonstration portion of the story toward the end is really kind of critical to understanding these characters' relationship, where they're really going back and forth, and every time you think you've got one character figured out, the other one does something that you're not quite sure about. Let's see. The question with number 5, this is ultimately a pessimistic story or an optimistic story, or do you do identity and friendship show themselves as transcendent, somehow undamaged by their essence, by change? What details in the story help you decide on your answer? And this is really something you can come up with on your own and really decide for your own after reading it. Now, with the other ones, I would just focus, like with the Salman Rushdie story. Who's the other author in there? The other Nobel Prize winners. It wasn't Monroe, even though she won the Nobel Prize. Look at my reading list. At any rate, 2 things you should examine with all the stories in this section. 1, what's the major theme going on in each story, and why is that important to the story? And 2, just like the question with women writers, think about what makes something a prize-winning story, or what style of writing seems to be prize-worthy. Now, you have the section that we read for last Thursday, the Nobel Prize winners, but you also have an author like Monroe and Junot Diaz, who have also won major awards, major prizes as well. What style of writing? Because they all have very different writing styles. What it at its essence seems to be award-worthy in writing. Okay. All right, that's about it as far as I have for the review and the question. I'll get the Ibsen questions definitely on the sheet before I email it to you. But do you guys have any questions about any of the works or the final, your research paper? That's fine.
I can think of right now was.
Feel comfortable? As comfortable as you can this time of year? Are all your finals this week, or do you have any next week?
I have one next week. Yeah, 2 next week.
Stop.